Welcome back to our growing experiment. We're here with Phil from Beautiful Field Farm. Phil, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm Phil Beauchamp. I'm the owner of Beautiful Field Farms. That's a name change just in the last year. Prior to that, it was Lewis Hardy Fruit Trees, which I think some people might be more familiar with in the community. Ron Lewis previously ran the business, I think, since 1982 or something like that. So it was always just like the best kept secret in Sudbury, just this really small backyard kind of nursery selling hardy fruit trees and things like that. So in the last kind of, I think 3 4 years since I've taken over, it's really been booming. We modernized some stuff, brought some stuff online, and it just seems to be huge demands. And I'm doing some different farming activities and different kind of stuff here on the land. So I changed the name to kind of reflect that kind of change in what we're doing.
Yeah, so being that you're selling trees, how do you get the fruit tree started? Are you starting from like a seed, or are you kind of grafting off of trees, or?
Yeah, so that's where we're seeing this shift in the business model. So historically, I mean, Ron just bought the hardy trees from the prairie nurseries. So they were started as trees. They'd come over, on a big semi truck. We'd unload them and kind of retail them all here. So that's still a big part of it. Most of the trees do come, via semi truck, for retail. But over the last 2 years, I've started some on-site propagation and doing different stuff like that.
Okay, and so when you're doing the on-site propagation, that's where you're taking part of another tree, or because you're not starting from seed, right?
Right. So it all depends on the variety, right? So most of the small bushes, we sell far more than just apple trees, right? We sell apples, pears, plums, cherries. We send a lot of shrubs, blueberries, um, high bush cranberries, haskaps, different things like that. So different different plants are propagated different ways, right? So a lot of the small shrubs and stuff, I'm doing cuttings, and cloning them. So either hardwood cuttings or semi-softwood cuttings, different times of the season, into some different beds here. And then the fruit trees we grow out from. You would start the rootstock separate, and then you would graft it onto the rootstock. So when it comes to the larger trees, they're all grafted onto a hardy rootstock with the desirable variety on the top half of the tree. So I've been buying rootstock the first couple of years and trying to get some of them growing out in the ground. And then I have a rootstock bed and I'm trying to grow out some crabapple rootstock myself.
Okay, and so the rootstock then, I
A
guess.
little bit of everything.
Sorry?
I like a little bit of everything, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, we can definitely get into the rootstock conversation. Some of it gets a little bit technical. So most hardy fruit trees or most any apple tree, let's just use apples for an example. Every single apple tree is grafted onto a rootstock, whether it's a Macintosh, Empire, a Gala, all those names you're familiar with, they're all grafted onto a rootstock. So the rootstock gives the tree more vigor, more disease resistance, different properties that are more desirable for the tree. They're grafted onto the rootstock and then grown out, right? So, in Southern Ontario and different places, they use different rootstock than the ones we use for Northern Ontario. So I usually try to use just bud rootstock, it's called. It's a like B series rootstock. It's from Russia, and it's like the hardiest rootstock that they've developed over the last period of time. So I do have some rootstock that I purchased like that, and I'm looking to clone them into new trees. So there's an interesting thing called a stool bed where you kind of plant the tree sideways in the ground, and then you'll cover it slowly with wood chips and let it set up new branches and suckers. And then you're going to slowly keep kind of layering it with more wood chips. This is like a layering technique you can do to propagate kind of most plants really. And then that area that's covered starts to develop roots. So then within another season, you can go back, take away the wood chips, and then you can trim off all the rooted pieces, replant and grow them out. So that's how rootstock's cloned, because you can't even grow out rootstock from a seed. The thing with apples in particular, any of these fruits, is that the fruits aren't true to seed. So because they've all been grafted along the way, or they're just the way that cross pollination works, it's not going to have the properties of the like cross pollination with any sort of fruit. It's not, or any sort of garden vegetable, right? It's not going to have the properties of the only the apple it comes with, but the pollen it donated from for the to create the fruit. So it's going to have properties of both those things. So depending on what, how it's pollinated, it's going to have very different characteristics.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
but yeah, so we have to clone those rootstocks through some, a layering technique, or, different kind of, I mean, in the big labs, they would do it with tissue cultures and different kind of things like this.
Okay. So I get that makes sense, because I guess basically when you're buying apples, if you're getting an apple that you don't know where the pollination happened and stuff, and you're going to get a very different apple than say what you're used to or what might be sort of appealing to you, right? I guess that's kind of the idea. It's sort of a quality control idea.
Yeah, so you have a desire, in a Macintosh apple has desired qualities that people like for eating, desired disease resistance on the trees. So yeah, so they just clone that. So every Macintosh apple comes from the exact same tree genetic wise. So if you come home and you cut your apple open and you plant your seeds, you're going to get a cross between a Macintosh and something else, probably some sort of crab apple that was planted in the orchard for a pollen donor,
Right.
Since a Macintosh and a Macintosh won't cross pollinate because they're essentially clones of each other, right? So they'll have some other variety planted in the orchard, likely some sort of crab or something that's, got really heavy blooms to pollinate. So then your apple will have those kind of characteristics.
Okay, and so it sounds to me then like with you getting apples or other kind of fruit off your tree, it sounds like you need the pollinators there. So that's why the crab apples you were saying were there. So I guess they're more abundant producers of pollen than say Macintosh or a different kind of apple tree.
Yeah, stuff like that, right? So when you're on a commercial scale, they probably need to know for sure, right? So they probably use trees like that. In a home orchard, any sort of second apple tree will generally work. As long as you have a second variety for pollination. So having those around, planting extras, stuff like that. So then when it comes to rootstock, if we go back to that, the other option for rootstock is not just cloning these kind of, superior genetic rootstock, is just planting a bunch of crabapple trees from a, mangy crabapple that's somewhere here, letting those grow up, and then you can use those crabapples as rootstock, because we know that, that tree's, lives in this kind of condition, right?
Right. So it's really taking it from a plant that's adapted to the area already. So that's the hardy part of the rootstock, I guess you were talking about there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I have some rootstock growing out, and then you do the grafting where you're attaching the desirable tree into the rootstock. You make a small notch and kind of attach it in, and it seals itself within a year or two and grows out to the new tree. So that's the propagating of the large apples and stuff like that I'm trying to incorporate here on site.
I've seen trees in the store before where they'll have like say 4 or 5 different kinds of fruit all on the same tree, and when you buy it, it all looks really small. And I gotta wonder, does that grow out to be like a full-size tree? Will it bear like say fruit like say a regular one or a mono kind of apple tree would? Or
Yeah. I mean, we sell some 4-in-1 trees and 3-in-1 trees, and I've certainly done a lot of that. In my home orchard, a lot of top work or grafting, different varieties onto the tree. And it's something I quite enjoy doing. So yeah, to do that, I mean, you just have to be really particular when you're pruning the trees for the first few years, so that you're keeping it balanced, so that each branch, grows to kind of a balanced amount. If you buy a 3-in-1 tree and just kind of neglect it, those smaller lower branches will probably never be your main fruiting branches, and the whole top of the tree will grow out, and then most of your apples on that tree will be like that. So once you have the successful grafts, you need to kind of shape those main branches.
Okay. And so I guess it's that makes sense. Like with any other kind of plant, you would want to sort of get rid of some of the leaves if they're preventing getting at the lower branches and stuff where you're going to have production issues, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. When it comes to, I mean, when it comes to, pruning apple trees or pruning any sort of shrubs or any sort of trees, that's something we get a lot of questions on. We cover quite a bit. Oftentimes we have education sessions here, so we'll usually try to do some grafting workshops and some pruning workshops in the spring, and then just some online content related to that kind of thing to just offer that education piece, because it's something that most people don't feel comfortable with, and they're reluctant to do, right? So you could make a strong argument for pruning badly is sometimes better than not pruning at all, where if you're just not pruning them, it's really going to cause them some other issues, right?
Mm-hmm. And
So
so
at least,
when you're pruning there, so it's just like you're kind of trying to make sure that there's not too much, say, leaves on the upper branches, and then also are you trying to like regulate sort of the branch length to some degree? Like how much shaping do you really do? And then another thing I would like to ask too on top of that is one of my concerns as a person who hasn't done any pruning or even just does a little bit of garden pruning, I always worry that like I'm going to hurt the plant or it'll be an entry point for disease. So how does that all kind of factor into the pruning?
right, yeah. So there's a lot of things to consider. Now we're getting into some serious pruning discussion. So the first thing is the time of year, right? So pruning while the tree's still dormant or just coming out of dormancy is one of your best times. Oftentimes I like to wait till they're just starting to come out of dormancy, because you can actually distinguish between the leaf buds and the fruit buds. So sometimes you take that into consideration when you're pruning. Sometimes if you have a nice branch with lots of fruit buds, you may end up leaving it, but anytime when it's dormant is ideal. Kind of the sooner the better. Not necessarily the dead of winter, so pretty much where we are now is kind of starting to get into ideal kind of pruning time. So by doing it at the right time, it gives the tree a chance to heal it off before it becomes a portal for infection. Microorganisms, fungus, pests, they're not very active right now, so it's not going to get into it as much. And then it gives the tree a chance to wake up and kind of, it's not like you hacked off its arm while it was still awake. It kind of came out of surgery and has a chance to heal, right? So it doesn't stress it as much as, if you hack somebody's arm off while they're wide awake,
Right.
So by doing it at that kind of year, it really helps. So that's kind of how you can eliminate those problems. There are sometimes reasons to prune at other times of the year, if you do want to, suppress some growth or stress your tree. The thing that's very important is that anything that's disease, dead, or damaged needs to be pruned right away. So regardless of time of year, so don't hesitate to cut off anything like that. That's kind of the one kind of rule of pruning. Anything dead, disease, damaged needs to come off right away. There's no point, speculating, waiting, especially if it's not a main tree. There's ways to kind of heal or fix a tree, that you can try for damaged branches, but ideally if you can, it's best to just prune it off, right? So the other thing to help it heal is by knowing where to make your cut. At a branch, the first kind of 1/4 inch or so, half a centimeter, is what they call the collar, where it starts flaring out a little bit and then comes out skinnier the rest of the way. So when you're pruning, you want to cut right at the end of that collar. So you want to cut it about, half a centimeter, 1/4 centimeter, 1/8 of an inch, however big your collar is. And by cutting right at that collar tissue grows and covers that hole quickly. If you cut back into the collar where you're cutting the collar off, then it doesn't heal as well. It's usually gangly and a big portal for infection. If you cut too long, it's going to heal back to the collar, and that little tip is going to start blackening and deading and rotting. So knowing where to make your cut is important. And then using clean equipment. So I try to wipe my pruners off between every tree or every couple trees, especially if there's a tree I think I'm a little bit worried about. With like a anything. I've read just about anything between peroxide, alcohol, bleach, vinegar. It doesn't have to be something. Just give it a quick wipe in between, and then using a good sharp pruner, right? So they make a pruner called a anvil pruner, where it's got a sharp section that goes to a flat section. Those are terrible. I'm not even sure why they manufacture those. So you want a bypass pruner that cuts across like scissors, and a nice good sharp one that's tight, so that it's not leaving mangly pieces.
Mm.
We've all tried to cut things with, a terrible pair of scissors, and it just kind of massacres, right?
Yeah.
So making sure you're making a nice clean cut is the best way to, prevent any of those problems when it comes to pruning. And you had asked about shaping, how much shaping needs to be done in that. So ideally, when you buy a tree, the first couple years is really focused on having your tree established and shaping it. So most of our trees, we try to, when time permits, to have them all pruned before they come out to you. So oftentimes people are surprised the trees are cut back a little bit smaller and less side branches than they would expect when you go buy it from other nurseries or other places, right? And the reason for that is that you really want to develop that strong, form and scaffolding right from the start, because it's very hard to correct once the tree's been growing out. So when it comes to, maximum production and growth, and ideal for these kind of fruit trees is, there's a bit of a technique to it. You want to aim for usually about 4 to 6 good side lateral branches. And you want to pick them, chest height or somewhere around there, where that's going to be kind of the final height of the branches. The branches aren't going to grow up and down anymore, right? So if they're about that height, they're ideal for picking, right? So having a 20-foot tall apple tree with apples way up at the top, it's super hard to pick. You want to climb up on a ladder, Ideally, you want to be using as much fruit as you can. So by keeping your tree that kind of 10-foot height, will help with that. So definitely picking those branches, those lateral branches to grow. And then you want to look for the right angle on the branch. So it needs to be usually between 45 and 60 degrees. If it's coming kind of straight up like this or coming too low, it's in the future, it's going to be a weak branch. So if you imagine it's like this, as it grows, the collar kind of comes in here and it creates a portal for splitting. And then if it's just too low, it has a tendency to split off too. So what we try to do when we're selecting the main branches is the other thing is you look kind of straight down on the tree, try to pick branches that are about 90 degrees from each other, in different cardinal directions, so that they aren't going to shadow each other in the future. And then 4 to 6 branches kind of like that. For the first couple years, it's just to give it that shape. And then there's lots more when it comes to, the annual pruning and stuff like that, but that's the shaping you were doing in the first couple of years. That's quite important for the long-term potential of your tree and your long-term, fruiting and production.
When do you usually start getting fruit on the tree? I guess it probably depends which fruit tree.
Yeah, it definitely depends on which fruit tree. Most of the apple trees, like the 3 to 5 years is when a tree will start producing fruit generally. Most of the trees, by the time they're here and ready for sale, they're usually about 3 years old. So oftentimes they'll flower and fruit the first or second year. What we recommend is the first year, it's unfortunate, but you should really take them all off. It just stresses the tree, too much to make fruit, right? You want it to really get established. Sometimes I'll tell people, I know most people won't do it, so I'll tell them, leave 1 or 2 so you can try the apple, right?
Yeah.
Ideally, take them all off, but go ahead and leave 1 and 2. The second year, you want to, at least thin about half, so that it's not, still getting a chance to really grow out. And then after that, you can let it go kind of full steam ahead. So usually within the second or third season, you're starting to get some apples from the trees we sell. Apples, anyways. Most of the shrubs will fruit the same year. You'll get a decent little harvest, and then same thing with the other big trees, pears and plums. Those are the other big tree varieties we sell, usually within a couple of years.
Okay.
And then, so I imagine you must have a bunch of fruit trees yourself. And that being the case, because it's a seasonal thing, you must do a lot of preserving. So how do you go about that? Or do you do much of it?
I wish I did. I do a lot of I do a lot of giving away, or the last couple of years, it's the business has been a bit bigger. I've been starting to just sell a little bit of the fruit at that time of year. But prior to that, I do just a lot of baking, I'll make half a dozen pies, maybe a dozen, 2 dozen pies, freeze them. I like to make crisps. They're super easy, I don't have to fiddle with the crusts, so
Yeah.
just put them right through the food processor, skin on, and bake a bunch of crisps, stuff like that. The apples can store quite a bit if you take them at the prime time, you store them in ideal conditions, so you can get up to 20 weeks sometimes on some apples. So, you can store quite a bit and eat them throughout the season as well.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because the reason we asked that question is in the last conversation we had with the Sudbury market, we were, talking about preserving and everything. And then the conversation about fruit came up, and she mentioned that she buys apples at the end of the season and she'll just preserve a bunch so that she's still eating local during the winter.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting thought that we've been kind of thinking about. So it's interesting, talking about fruit trees and everything, and where our mind is shifting is trying to figure out ways where we can eat that all year long. So preserving would be a good way to do that, right?
Definitely, yeah. I'd say, anything when it comes to the kitchen is not a homesteading skill I excel at. So unfortunately, I don't do, much of that preserving and stuff like that, although, it would be great. All the berries, everything else, makes excellent jams and preserves.
Yeah.
Wow. And then speaking of berries, that's kind of a good segue into, I found a couple of little strawberries in our yard by the fence. They're in a fairly shaded area, but I was surprised to find them. So there was probably 3 or 4 little areas where I could see like flowers or strawberries coming up. What could I do to maybe help those strawberries thrive a little bit more so I could kind of create a strawberry patch there? Or should I just plant more strawberries that's already like in there with those ones? Or
Well, yeah, is that location like desirable for long term, or is it, close to a fence line, close to something you're going to be doing, right? This is
so it's like it could be a long-term place, like it's kind of out of the way, which I don't mind.
Yeah. Okay. And have you grown and then we always recommend growing it out and making sure it's a desirable strawberry. Like, is it something that you like, that a variety you want before, we consider even, saving it or moving it. Strawberries, depending on the variety, will throw off a runner halfway through the season. They'll throw off a small little vine. It'll reroot itself in the ground. The easiest way is to move those runners. They're pretty much not even rooted when they first come out. So you can grab those runners and start placing them anywhere you want. Otherwise, for strawberries, like you say, they get tangled up and lost in everything, right? They're very, very low to the ground and stuff around. They don't compete well. So generally, any strawberry bed you want to be mulched really heavily. So just mulching everything around it. And usually when I mulch, or what I recommend is putting down a layer of either newspaper or cardboard before your mulch. And it just helps you really smother the little grass, whatever else is around, So if you wanted to, keep those where they are, you could, mulch around them and kind of let them go, or you could just start moving the runners to a different location. You can always dig them up and try moving them too. It all depends on time of year and how much roots you get. Generally, the earlier you can move anything, the better. So if you can get it out of the ground before it started even blooming, and kind of where it is and where the roots are, you can, dig it up and move it, and it should be happy to wake up in its new location.
Yeah, it's really cool because it sounds like getting started out in gardening and stuff like that. I always worried that stuff was really easy to kill, but it sounds like things are fairly resilient. And as long as you go about it the right way, you can actually sculpt, shape, move, transport, whatever, a lot of these plants to a lot of different places, especially with these fruit trees.
Yeah, it would definitely. If it's dormant, you can definitely, you can definitely do it. A lot of the fruit trees we sell, or the ones we buy, they actually come bare rooted. So they come on the truck, just a stick with no, the roots are just kind of dangling out, exposed to air, no nothing, no dirt attached. They are usually put in some sort of peat moss and wrapped just in case they come out of dormancy, but they're stored at these places just in a cold storage like that with roots exposed, right? So once it's dormant, it doesn't need anything. So, but once it starts waking up, once it's growing, those roots are super susceptible to drying out or damage or things like that. So if you move stuff early in the season, it's usually pretty straightforward. The trouble comes when you start splitting stuff or moving stuff, in the middle of the growing season. Then you're very unlikely to have any success with that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's really interesting because that kind of really changes a lot about how I looked at those plants and what you could kind of do with them and stuff. Like thinking about, as long as they're sort of dormant or kind of like asleep almost, you can move them. But when when they're
Yeah.
in sort of the budding of life or whatever, you can't cut them down or they won't come back.
Yeah, exactly. It gets to be much, much harder to move them and keep them alive. They're more susceptible to problems and things like that. So that's why our season starts quite early, we start usually in April or end of or start of May or end of April with selling the trees. And by June, when most of the garden centers are really getting into full swing, we're pretty much, starting to close down for the season.
Right.
Like it's ideal to get the trees in the ground. That's a conversation I have with everybody when they pick up their tree. I tell them to get them in the ground right away, and they say, well, maybe I'll keep it in the garage for a month till it gets better. And I say, please don't,
Mm-hmm.
get it in the ground as soon as you can. Like it wants to wake up in its new location and kind of grow there, right? So getting your big trees, into the ground as soon as possible is, the very best thing for them.
So early spring would be the best time to plant trees and shrubs?
Yeah.
Because I
Yeah,
have
as soon as I would say, like what's always said is as soon as the ground's workable, like as sooner the better, right? So if you can get a shovel in the ground in March in some location and you have a tree you want to move, then great, Oftentimes the ground's still frozen solid till mid-April or so. But yeah, as soon as you can kind of get it and move it is the best time. Yeah.
Do you do any other type of gardening?
I have a small vegetable garden that I kind of attempt. It's not hugely productive, but the fruit is the big thing I do. The fruits, the berries, the shrubs. I generally have pretty much one of everything I sell planted. So I have some experience with growing everything. I try to we try to test and choose varieties that we enjoy ourselves and that we're more successful. So if I bring in a variety and grow it out a couple of years and it's not doing well, it's not one I'm gonna sell. Or varieties that grow out and I don't find the apple very good, or it's a low, just doesn't produce very well. It's not one we'll sell. So we do that kind of on-site testing and experimenting with everything we grow. So
Yeah, and that's really important too, because I think you got to have a plant or a tree that really wants to grow in this area, right? And like you got to kind of test it out a little bit, especially considering if you're getting them from somewhere else and they started off in a slightly different environment. Like every little bit is different, the soil and all that, I imagine.
yeah, choosing the tree you're going to plant or the shrub you're going to plant is one of the most important things. Oftentimes that people will sell anything, right? So a lot of the kind of pop-up garden centers sell, you could buy a Empire or a Gala or a Macintosh apple or things that aren't particularly hardy. You could buy them and it might live for a couple seasons, but it's not going to be long-term successful. It's not going to be as productive. So being mindful of the variety you're buying, and oftentimes the rootstock is grafted on. If it's grafted onto an Ottawa or Minnesota series rootstock or things like that, they're not going to be as hardy.
Yeah, totally different climate. And another thing that I seen on your page there that I thought was really cool was the rocket mass heater you guys had in your greenhouse. I've heard about these things a couple of times and they seem like they're really cool and really like efficient when it comes to how much fuel you're using versus how much heat you get. So what can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so that's a fun little experiment. Like I said, I have where I'm located, I have 70 acres, so I do a little bit of, the fruit trees, and that's the main thing. I do a lot of other little stuff I like to dabble in. So we have chickens out back. I graze some pigs through the forest, some different kind of stuff. I like to experiment with different, passive building designs and different stuff like that. I built a cob-based chicken coop last year. And then this winter I built a greenhouse and I'm trying to be as passive as I can in it, right? So I'm doing some thermal mass storage with some water jugs and stuff like that. And it's still really experimental, but this winter I built a rocket mass heater. So for people that aren't familiar, it's a kind of wood stove, but instead of the pipes kind of leaving and exhausting up like they would, they actually exhaust through a thermal mass or a thermal storage. So it actually goes through a bunch of dirt or whatever you're using for thermal mass, so that as hot air is exhausting and leaving, it's heating up this mass and kind of becoming a thermal battery is what they refer it to. So it's been a fun little project. Unfortunately, doing it in wintertime is terrible. You think you need to make cob out of mud, and you need to, mix up dirt and, try to pack it tightly around all your heat vents and stuff like that. So, I've been slowly heating up a little bit at a time and trying. So it's finally built. It still needs to be warm enough so that I can properly, compress the mass and stuff like that. Because if you imagine, the way it was frozen, the pipes run through and then it just thaws out the inside, evaporates all the water from the snow. So it's not currently heating the mass like it's supposed to. It heats the mass a bit, and it gets hot. I mean, this weekend when we had full sun and I had the heater going, it was 36 degrees in the greenhouse. So I mean, it works. It really, between the sun, it heats up. So yeah, the rocket mass heater is a exciting little project for thermal mass and passive building design. But I'm hoping next winter, when I have it for the full winter and I've did some modifications and some different stuff, that it's going to be pretty successful. Everything I've read about it is super successful, and everybody's super happy with them. So especially for applications like that, but it is super efficient. Like you say, you fill up the feed chamber, which is 24 inches by 24 inches, so essentially one log cut up into pieces. It burns for 45 minutes. It throws off huge heat for that 45 minutes, and then it heats up your bench, which gets up to 30 degrees ish, 40 degrees ish, and then slowly dissipates heat over time. So for that kind of thing, for a greenhouse or something passive, it works really well.
Is that your goal, to be growing in your greenhouse next winter?
Yeah, so I'm using it, like the plan is more for propagation. Some of the early propagation techniques and stuff like that need kind of an area like that. That's, warmer and earlier seasons. So I can do some of my cuttings and stuff like that. I'm going to put my sand beds and different things in there, and then potentially starting some seedlings. A lot of some of the native plants and native varieties we sell can be grown by seed. So starting seedlings in there early in the season and stuff like that.
Okay, that's really cool. That heat mass there, that makes a lot of sense. I think that's one thing I've been seeing is it's a lot of times our energy usage is just we're not really maximizing the efficiency of the energy we're burning, right? So like using that rocket mass heater where you're heating up the geosync or the heat sink, it's going to radiate over time all that heat, and you only burned wood for 45 minutes instead of, say, you have to feed it all the time, right? And it's going to maintain probably a more consistent temperature. And the same thing you mentioned with the water, because we have a greenhouse there that has a big water tank in it as well. And once it gets warm in there, it's been getting up to about 30 degrees in there. And I think now it's going to keep staying above zero. And I think pretty soon we're probably going to start throwing stuff out there.
Yeah, that's half the battle, right? Especially if you're doing any sort of passive building or whatever, you're trying to harness and store the energy, right? So the sun's only out in the day. So if you can, not only does the mass heater heat the mass, but the sun heats the mass. Just having that thermal mass inside your greenhouse can help really store it. And then, the water is a great way to store the thermal mass, and the sun's energy, and then it can come out overnight and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And we also saw on your page something about, I guess in the past you were selling worms and you were looking into doing that again. What can you tell us a little bit about that?
Oh yeah, I think at the time I was looking to just get some worms. So I have a small worm factory, a small vermicomposter in my it's in the greenhouse now. It came out of the basement, so it's in there. And I was just looking for worms because it was a little bit neglected. So it's just another little experiment. I like to, like I say, dabble in a little bit of everything. So, a little bit of vermicomposting. We haven't sold worms in the past. There's a gentleman in town, Ormure Organics, I think it's called. We've sold his worm castings last year. So he creates them at a larger scale and he provides them for retail sales. So we sold some of those last year.
Okay. Yeah, we were looking at getting some, so that's why that kind of stood out to us a little bit, and that's why we kind of figured we'd ask.
Yeah, what'd you say his name was? Boromir?
Ormure, Omirur, something like that. Ormure Organics. He does worm casting. That's not his name. His name's something normal.
That's the business.
Jim or something. But yeah, he's a great guy. He was out a few times last year, but he's doing that as a larger scale. Yeah, the worm composting's been great. I mean, years ago when I was doing it regularly, like the amount of organics it can process at a quick rate is pretty impressive, where if you have a traditional compost pile, it takes, 1 or 2 seasons to mature enough, right? But, when I had my little worm factory going, within a month, you're cycling the trays and you're getting kind of, maybe a gallon of material every month, so it worked quite well. Then you're getting the fluids coming out the bottom, what they call the leachate, and there's ways to process that into like a really desirable compost as well.
Okay, so that must be like part of their waste product that kind of comes out the bottom, and so what would you do to process that to use that?
I mean, it's something I didn't actually do. There's a bubbling it and diluting it and stuff like that to, change the chemistry somehow, you know,
Yeah.
not it's just something with an air stone and water and enough time or something.
Okay.
Do you use any type of fertilizer for your trees, or do you?
No, I like to keep to, my really kind of permaculture homesteading practices. So I don't use any sort of active fertilizer. I don't use, any sort of commercial anything, any sort of pellets, any sort of liquids. Biggest thing I do is just mulch and some compost. So if I have some nice compost, like last year we sold the Meeker's mix, the fish compost from Manitoulin Island. It's really quite premium stuff. So put a little layer of that down, then I'll put this is similar to what I do either when I'm rejuvenating an old tree or when I'm planting a tree. Put some sort of desirable compost down a little bit. I'll put my newspaper or cardboard, and then I'll just put as much mulch as I can, a super thick layer of wood chips or leaves. I'm that guy in October, November, driving around the neighborhood, filling up bags of leaves, and just adding that organic matter to the orchard floor every year.
Yeah.
It's perfect. I just, open up the bags, put the bag down first, and just pour the leaves right on top of them. And it'll just, decompose, hold moisture. Mulching is one of the keys to successfully growing, a fruit tree or a shrub, just to hold moisture, to add nutrients, to keep down pests and competition. It's like the most important, best thing you could do, and just mulch around your trees. Yeah.
And what kind of issues would you say or challenges do you face with the trees living here in the north more than you would anywhere else?
Well, of course, the climate. I mean, the climate's going to be the toughest one, right? So just selecting a good tree and being aware of your local conditions and microclimates and stuff, right? So people with a nice, lakeshore property with, crazy wind all the time and stuff might want to choose slightly hardier plants, right? So choosing that, and then, getting through the winters with your plants is one of the things. I've occasionally had, a grazing animal come through and, take a little bit of fruit, but it's not a huge issue. I back right onto forest, and I have a little neighborhood kind of across the street. It's just like a different little place. But, I have bears come through the property on a regular basis, and they're more interested in the trash or a popsicle stick the kids leave on the ground, that it pretty much ignores the fruit trees. So I know I don't have too many problems like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
The biggest problem and the thing that's killed most of my trees is just, doing things wrong. When I first started, I just, stuck trees wherever I wanted, where I thought, would be a good place for me, not for the tree, and didn't really, cut the grass around it and, whacked it with the whippersnipper maybe and made some, simple mistakes. They are susceptible to those kind of things, to, us, just killing them. So most of the problems I've had is with that, really.
So when you're looking out for a spot to put it in your yard, then what are you looking for ideal characteristics?
Yeah, so you're looking at, of course, sun. Most big fruit trees or trees want full sun. So definitely something that doesn't get too much shade, right? So looking at that kind of thing, and then just your soil conditions and the competition, which is another big thing. So if you have a bunch of mature pines or spruce in your yard, you have to imagine the roots on those, is just dramatic, right?
Mm-hmm.
So one big spruce on the corner of your property is probably close to the foundation of your house, the roots, right? So thinking that you're going to plant an apple tree right in the middle of your yard, 20 feet from, the spruce, it's going to be a problem because of the competition from the roots and stuff like that. And then your soil conditions and moisture levels. So if you're any place that kind of holds a lot of water, starts puddling up in the spring and gets wet, for too long, that becomes an issue. You have to do some certain things to kind of plant it higher, create a mound for the tree and stuff like that. But like the competition and the moisture are the most important things, and of course the sun. But I think the competition is something people underestimate a lot, is they plant it too close to big mature trees that have huge root systems, and they'll steal a lot of everything from under there.
Is there anything you can kind of do to kind of be able to still do it? Like, is there something you could do, or is it just not a good spot at all?
No, like, your tree's always going to be stunted. So if you want your apple tree to be, 8 or 10 feet, or you want your shrub to stay smaller, sometimes planting it with competition can, change the growth parameters. It'll never get too big, right? So it may be beneficial, definitely, you want to dig an extra wide hole. You want to really hack the roots away, cut off everything. The big tree's not going to mind, if you cut, a 6-foot section of its roots off, so do that. And then, you could put it a little bit higher so that it has some of its own new dirt that it's kind of got just for itself. And then the mulching and the, really smothering it and that kind of stuff, so it's a highly nutrient dense area, can help.
That kind of makes me think too that, like, because I'm thinking about our backyard where we have a lot of trees and there would be a lot of root competition. And I was thinking to myself that it might make sense to maybe do, like, say, a shrub or a bush of some kind, like, because you were mentioning other different varieties you had of shrubs and bushes. So what about something like that?
Yeah, there's a lot of shrubs that compete quite well, and there's other shrubs that don't compete at all. The sour cherries are a particularly kind of dainty plant. Like, it needs, it doesn't compete at all. So avoiding things like that. Things like raspberries, strawberries, I mean, they can be planted as companions, in the shade of something. Currants, elderberries, they like the shade, they don't mind that kind of stuff at all. So there's certainly varieties that do well. So it's trying to pick and choose the locations, for those things.
Okay. And I'm thinking too, like, our backyard, the way our backyard goes, it's kind of like rocky the way it goes up, but there's a few different pine trees, and there was some maple trees there and some birch. So, I mean, they were fairly big. So I imagine there must be something for them to dig into. So, like, I mean, if you had like an apple tree or something like that, you need to have like a fairly deep hole dug for it to actually have roots. Like, because my concern would be that I say wouldn't have enough depth to really accompany a plant like that, maybe.
Yeah, you won't know, won't know until you try. Trees often will live just about anywhere you planted. You alluded to that, trees growing out of rocks, trees growing out of old structures. Oftentimes, nature will find a way, and it might grow or thrive. It might not have the longevity as another tree, but if you're going to be in the house for 20 or 40 years, that might be enough. You don't need the tree to live 200 years if you're not going to be there 200 years, right? So, I mean, of course, the ideal conditions are better, but you could get away with, planting it into a shallow hole and, just hoping it goes out laterally more. You might want to mulch some more. You might want to feed it some more. People grow, some of our trees and some of our stuff in pots, right? And, that's not a great condition for it. But if you're, managing the soil conditions, if you're more rigorous with your water and stuff like that, then it can survive and grow. You just have to be aware of those conditions and then treat them accordingly. Supplemental water, things like that.
Okay. Yeah, I guess it is kind of a little bit of, you got to be willing to just kind of try it and go here, go there, try to make it work. I mean, you don't really know it's going to work until you try it. Because, I mean, as much as we could sort of talk about it sort of in theory, right? Like, you don't know about the spot in my yard that I'm really talking about. And I don't really know how deep I can dig in. So.
Yeah, and you don't know if, somebody dug it out and poured, gravel in there when they redid your driveway 10 years ago, before you bought the place. Like that might not be something you know until you put the shovel in the ground, right?
Right.
So, when we recommend people to, when people want recommendations on where to plant and stuff, I tell them to do some of those things, dig out your soil and see what it's like, put a stake in the ground for a week, and see if it's going to be an eyesore, see if it's where you want to see it, see if it gets enough sun during the day. Taking, if you just want to plant one apple tree, you want it to be really successful and ideal, then take a look at some of those kind of conditions, and have that, go in with that mindful approach of what you're gonna do. I think that's important, and I've talked to a lot of people out of buying a lot of trees, like I'm not around just to sell trees to people that are going to go and die, right? There's a lot of people that with ambitious plans, they want trees and they're going to plant them in their, quarter acre backyard, and they've never planted a tree before. I convince them to, start a little bit small, see how things go. Like, so just being mindful of that when you're planting, or if you're willing to accept the loss and just plant like crazy, then you'll learn along the way, which is pretty much what I did.
Yeah, well, that's nice to hear though too, that you because I know, especially when we talk to a lot of different people who start getting involved and thinking about permaculture type of ideals and growing their own food and all that kind of stuff. That's one of the things that you kind of run into is like, oh, you got these big ideas sort of in the beginning, you go and you kill a bunch of stuff, or you get discouraged, or a combination of those things. So it's good to be mindful of that. And then another thing that I remember too that you were saying earlier, you were talking about like the longevity of, say, a tree. So I guess that means that, like, say, a tree growing in less than optimal conditions, you could have grow for a few years, but then at some point it sort of dies off, versus a tree that lives in ideal conditions will live like a very long time. So does that mean like it sort of depletes the nutrients or of the area of where it's at, or it just gets out competed by the surrounding things? Like what really makes the difference between, say, a short-lived tree and a long-lived tree?
Yeah, it'll be exactly that, like what you alluded to. It'll be the growing conditions, right? So if it's in a kind of an ideal area, it doesn't have competition, doesn't experience a flood one year, or different things like that, it'll be happy and live forever. But yeah, if it's really struggling, and you'll see that the trees that just aren't doing well, they struggle for a couple of years, they don't put on a lot of new growth, they grow differently when they're kind of stressed. So you see these different kind of things, and you can kind of know. I've seen some of mine, I've seen, stressed for a year or two, and then I really go and, turn some soil, do some things, do a whole new mulch layer and stuff like that. And they can bounce back, or go for a few more years.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a thing that we've talked about for a long time, and it's kind of funny. Like we've wanted, say, fruit trees for a long time, but then we keep thinking like, oh, where are we going to plant it and all that kind of stuff. But then you kind of kick yourself in the ass, because really, if that tree was already there,
Just do it.
you'd be already have fruit off of it, right?
Yeah.
Instead of thinking about planting.
Yeah, that's one of the sayings, right? The best time to plant a tree was last year, and the next best time is right now. So yeah, the sooner you get in the ground, the better, right? They need time to grow and things like that. So
And
definitely, give it a try, and if you follow a few principles, your tree will probably do just fine.
and you said a lot of your trees are already on the third year when you're selling them, which would mean
Yeah, most of them are at least 3 to 4 years old when they come from the nurseries and stuff like
so
that. They
when we
have to have
would
a
plant
big enough.
them, there would be fruit in the first year or the second year or so. Is that correct?
Oftentimes, yeah, oftentimes people have fruit within the second year, and if you're treating the tree right and doing certain things to help it fruit, it usually will. You have to have like a pollinator, so you'll need something close by, whether it's a second tree of your own or your neighbors or something like that. So paying attention to those kind of things. But yeah, no, there's a lot of people with really, really successful trees, right? So, we really stress a lot of that education portion, as much as the, just selling a tree, we want you to succeed, right? So, we're going to start you off with the right tree, but making sure you're doing it just right. So there is a bit of educational content on the site. There's an associated YouTube channel with me going on and on about stuff, so trying to offer that piece. Most people, when they come and buy their tree, they're spending 10-15 minutes going through a rundown. A lot of people have a tree they planted before, they just want to kind of troubleshoot problems, so we do a lot of that kind of stuff.
And I imagine too, when you're having something that you want to pollinate your plant, it must be like another is it just like another fruit tree, or does it have to be another apple tree? Or because it was crab apples we mentioned earlier, but could like if you have a pine tree in your yard that throws pollen, I mean that's not going to work, right?
No, no, it has to be the same species, right? So, pears have to pollinate pears, apples pollinate apples. When you get into the cherries and the plums, like the prunus family they're all kind of similar. So there are some cherries that'll pollinate plums and some plums that'll pollinate cherries, and there's some overlap with that kind of thing because they're all in the same actual family, but generally you need the same species, so an apple, a pear and a pear.
Okay.
Yeah, like so a crab apple is a Latin malus. It's in the same family, right? So crab apple will pollinate an apple. So if they're in the same family species, they'll pollinate.
Okay. And then so you were mentioning different species of apples that they say were growing down south around Ottawa or something. So what's the varieties of apples that say you sell that do well up here?
Yeah, so two of my favorites are Gemini and Goodland apples. They're excellent, firm, crisp, big, fresh eating apples. So those are two of our favorites. Prairie Sensation's a great apple. Norland and Norkent are really, really hardy apples. They do really well. They're a little bit earlier season, but they're excellent apples. And then those are the main ones. We do have a few other ones here or there. They have other desirable qualities too. That's something we'll go through when people buy an apple too. What other kind of apple do you like? Do you want it for cooking? Do you want it more for fresh eating? Because some apples are super soft with really thin skin. So when you make your crisper pie and you don't peel it, you don't even notice that you left the skin on. And other ones are more firm skinned. Other ones store better. Oftentimes people want like a longer harvest period, so you'll get kind of an August apple, a mid-September, and a late September apple. So you're getting a lot of different times for your apples. So yeah, generally they're not names you would recognize.
Well, I mean, that's kind of fun because another thing that we've been sort of learning when talking to other people too is we got to kind of discover what the taste of Sudbury is in a way, or a taste of this Northern Ontario area. It's because, all of the food we get kind of comes from somewhere else. We don't really know what food tastes like that's grown here until we really start exploring the varieties of food that will actually grow here. So like growing something like a Gemini apple, like I've never heard of. It's like, well, you give it a shot, and I imagine it's a great apple because I've had apples that have been grown in places like this, and they're just fine.
Yeah, so that's an interesting thing you brought up because that's something that interests me quite a bit. Is that there are people in the city that historically grew apples from seed, right? And they'll say 1 in 1,000 apple from seed is actually good and desirable and will grow here, right? So it's but if everybody else is planting apples, one thing I like kind of doing is learning from people that have an apple tree in their yard that, they think planted from a seed, and trying to check out some of those apples and maybe, doing some grafting of those onto my trees and experimenting with that and just having the different genetic diversity in our trees too, right? Which I think is important long term, looking at some of that genetic diversity thing.
Yeah, it's a cool idea, right? Because if they've grown here, then they're already accustomed to this climate. So just producing more of those apples might be good.
Yeah, so that's something that this year and further seasons that I want to take more interest in, finding some, particularly neglected crabapple trees and using those for, rootstock trees and stuff like that, assuming that they have, really good, vigorous qualities and stuff. So keeping and coming to those things in mind and doing things more, as natural as I can.
Yeah, and even like if a person had space to do it, say planting just different apple seeds from apples you grow in around the area and see what you get and all that kind of thing, might be one of those things that 1 in 1,000 you don't get. But say, I mean, you're going to be living there for however many years and you got time, it's like you grow it, see what happens. If it's no good, cut the tree down, plant another one, and on you go. I mean, I don't know how much you could accomplish in that kind of lifetime doing it, but I mean, you might get a couple good apples, you think.
Yeah, no, I definitely have a few customers that plant apple trees, and they tell me every year how they're growing, and some people have some success and they enjoy the apples they've grown from seed, oftentimes, they have undesirable qualities, but if depending on what you want it for, if you've got lots of room and you're gonna like extra apple tree and you want to feed the birds, like, it's great. Plant an apple tree from seed, and help, increase the genetic diversity and stuff.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for coming and talking to us and teaching us a little bit about what it goes into grafting and pruning, maintaining, taking care of these kind of trees and stuff. So for anyone who's listening, would you like to let them know how they could get a hold of some of your trees?
Yeah, for sure. So we have the website, beautifulfieldsfarm.com. We have the associated, social media is Instagram, Facebook. You could follow there, and then the YouTube channel for some of the educational content and stuff. We usually, the last couple of years, due to demand, what we do is we launch the website usually sometime around end of March for ordering. And then when the trees come in April, we, start selling them and arranging pickups and stuff like that. It's just been, there's been so much interest in this in the last few years. It's the only way to really keep up.
Great.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, nice to meet you guys. Great to
Yes,
chat
nice to
today.